Geographic magazine. Our session is Fast Forward, Ethics and Politics in the Age of Global Warming. If you think you're here for another session, please stay anyway. Okay. I'm delighted today to have as our two panelists, Strobe Talbott. Strobe is president of the Brookings Institution. He became so in 2002, following a very distinguished career as a journalist, 21 years with Time magazine, government and academia. And one thing I picked up from Strobe's recent book, Fast Forward, and we'll talk about this more in a minute. Bill was the author as well. And look at them, they're sitting next together and they're still friends. It's astonishing.
The panel's not over yet.
But the panel, that's right. We've got an hour and a few odd minutes. But Strobe's father, Bud, 25 years ago, was talking to you about global climate change and the importance for all of us, for all humanity. To Strobe's right is Wiliam Antholis. Wiliam is the managing director of the Brookings Institution. He helps manage its range of policy studies, develops new initiatives, coordinates research across programs. Bill's wife, Kristen, was an advocate of both of you writing Fast Forward, and she has a career in nuclear security and environmental protection.
We would have been better served having Bud and Kristen up here as opposed to me and Strobe, I think.
You know, I wondered about that as I read the book. We had a delightful breakfast this morning, and one thing I do want to ask you to right off the bat is, where do you get your hair cut?
Same place you do.
Okay, all right. All right. What I'd like to do is...
This is going to be a tough panel.
What I'd like to do is first tell all of you, buy this book. It's very, very good. Published by the Brookings Focus Group. But if you want a good, thoughtful guide to global climate change, this is it. And it's new and fresh. It came out in April of this year. And it was especially poignant to me when I was reading the book because as editor-in-chief of National Geographic magazine, we really began covering climate change in earnest with a cover story in May of 1998, Unlocking the Climate Puzzle. And in the subsequent time since then, as we've continued to learn about global climate change, as we've continued to cover it with increasingly conclusive and thoughtful science, we have noticed, especially in the past 24 months, an uptick in letters to the editor, in letters to the staff of the Geographic, and the tone of these letters has changed considerably, and the frequency of these letters. What I'd like to do is quickly share 3 letters that were sent to me in the past few months. Here is one from June of 2007. It's a gentleman named Brad Jacks who lives in Florida. And he wrote, "I just wanted to let you know that your scientists and so-called experts are liars concerning global warming. I don't believe anything you people say about the planet and your phony theories. Your scientists and experts covered up the facts that prove global warming does not exist. This makes you a conspirator of creating a fraud on the entire world. Take your magazine and societies and shove them where the sun does not shine." He went on later to tell me he was canceling his subscription as well. Not to be outdone, T.B. Heaver, from somewhere out there in cyberspace, connected with AOL, wrote me the following letter. Now, we're all adults in this room, so language will be used that is not used in National Geographic magazine. "Howdy. You fucking dumb shits. I am not happy, you morons. You do not have any evidence that we are the cause of global climate change, and that you are giving people the idea that global warming is not a natural occurrence. Why don't you people just do something useful and report about things that are true and things that people really care about? It's people like you that ruin everything. You fucking dummies. TBH. Now, here's a personal one to me. Dear Mr. Johns, I burst out laughing when your editor's note on page 4 of February 2010 issues, wherein you claim that, quote, in a world full of shrill voices and agendas, we at National Geographic are committed to an unbiased presentation of facts. Really? As an earth scientist of 53 years' experience, I have noted for years your magazine's bias towards anthropogenic global warming, now termed climate change. You ignore the fact that a position signed by over 31,000 scientists, plus thousands of other knowledgeable observers, have rejected this theory. In the scientific world, consensus doesn't cut it. Your constant hammering on this in every issue caused me to drop my subscription for a while. I, however, do enjoy the beautiful photography, so I rejoined while holding my nose. So at least I haven't lost a subscriber yet there, and that's Willis Anthrop, MS, Kerrville, Texas. Someone from Kerrville here? Well,
Why don't you give a copy to him so he can go call on him? What he
yeah, I can. I've got a whole list
You
of
can
these.
make
if
a
you
house
wanna-
call.
Yeah, a whole pile of them if you want to read them later. But the point of this is that our readers are not fucking dummies. Our readers are well-educated people who really care about this world. I don't think they'd be reading National Geographic magazine. And what we strive to do at National Geographic is be a bridge builder. I want Republicans, Democrats, I want conservatives, I want Muslims, I want Christians. I want to be a bridge builder with this magazine across society. And what concerns me is the tone of some of the notes that are completely different than they were in many ways 24 months ago, with obscenities and things. I mean, I'm just not really accustomed to this. And I have to say, Bill, Strobe, what's happening and what do we do about it?
Let me take a first crack at it, Chris, and I'll start with a non-gratuitous compliment, which is the extraordinary public service that you and National Geographic have performed on this issue. We like to think that we're in the business of public education too, but boy, you are, and big time, and in an extraordinarily constructive and high impact way. And I think it's a kind of a perverse indication of the impact you're having that you can elicit this kind of response from people who still have some educating to be done. With a group like this, we don't need to waste a nanosecond on going over the merits of the argument, obviously, or even the amount of energy that has gone on, including from high levels of government, to persuade people about the facts. So the question is, why is there still so much resistance? I think there are perhaps a couple of factors that have come together in a kind of a perfect storm, and at a very, very unpropitious time, given the fact that 2010 is, still might be a potential, if not last chance, then at least a critical chance not to lose, to finally get our country's act together on this issue. And it looks like we may be losing it. And one reason we may be losing it, one reason we are losing it, I'm sure, is because of two related phenomena. One is the rise of mistrust of what governments, and not to mention international institutions, have to say. We can see that in the polls. The other is a fear factor. People are frightened about the various threats to their their lives as they have gotten used to living them. And that is largely a consequence, of course, of the financial economic crisis. But when you pile on top of that, here's another nightmare scenario to take really seriously and think about making adjustments in the way you live and how much taxes you're going to pay. It just comes up against an even tougher wall than before. In addition, there is at least in my lifetime, in my life in Washington, I'm not only bald, such hairs as I have are pretty gray. I have never seen a breakdown in the civility of public and political discourse of the sort that we have now. And we have colleagues at Brookings, Bill and I, who've gone back and studied this historically, and there have been a lot of four-letter words thrown around in American politics and going back to the founding of the country, but the toxicity of it is especially bad right now. I think that's just all come together, and I think that it presents a huge challenge to all of us, whether we edit magazines or work in think tanks or teach or in public life. Public education is it's like wars are too important to leave to the generals. Changing public attitudes can't be left to our political leaders. We got to do it ourselves, or we got to big-time help.
How do we do that, Bill?
Well, I think one of the things that Strobe touched on is something that people who care about an issue like this across the political spectrum, short of the extremes, they need to look to some of the devices that the extremes have been quite good at and master them in a way that, as we like to say at Brookings, heightens the impact without eroding the quality or the independence of the work. So, two of the things that I think have made letters like yours much more prevalent part of the debate is that money focuses on the extremes of politics and money doesn't focus in the center. It empowers people at the extremes with a more democratized set of media tools like the internet and radio and also television with cable television to get their voices out there. So I think people who are, I like to say that we wrote the book not for us fucking dummies, but for a generally a general audience that's not as educated. The extremes tend to be very educated on this issue, and even the not so far extremes, say to the left. But people in the center are not particularly well educated, so they need to be educated, and then they need to be empowered to speak up. And so we tried really in the book to aim. We were always thinking, what would a skeptical conservative, but one open to persuasion, say about almost every line in the book? We hard edited it in that way. What do we really not know about climate change? And how can we describe the importance of action amidst uncertainty as a reason for acting, not just the certainty of the things that we do know? And not just on the science side, but on the economics and on the politics. In all three of those realms, the thing I think that is that inhibits our ability to persuade the persuadable is a degree of certainty that it sometimes is overstated on the part of people that want to do something about climate change. Being honest about what we don't know, but saying that that is not a reason for not acting. In fact, what we don't know may be even more extreme than we think it is right now.
This morning I had breakfast with Jim Barry, and we were talking about ocean acidification. And I'm interested in your thoughts about this because ocean acidification is actually, I think, a little easier actually significantly easier to prove. Is that an argument that, or a piece of enlightenment that we should bring more to the public consciousness because it's frankly it's easier to understand?
I quarrel with the premise. I think, let me just stipulate, of course, it's a critically important issue. I have a friend and cousin named Barry Moore who's been running Climate Central and is now involved in a new effort out at the University of Oklahoma. And he thinks ocean acidification is going to be the tipping point issue on a lot of fronts, notably including, of course, the fisheries of the world, but also the direction of currents and that kind of thing. But it's too complicated. I think the fact that it's easier to prove scientifically shouldn't be the compelling point. The compelling point, it seems to me, is to get people to accept the same principle that they incorporate into their own lives when they buy insurance. Persuade them not that the Earth is going to be such and such a median temperature in 2050, because we don't know what the median temperature is going to be. It depends on a lot of variables, including on what we knew. But to persuade them that it already has warmed up. There's no dispute. Well, I shouldn't say there's no dispute. There's no intelligent refutation of that, and that there are already causes of climate change, and there's every sign that they're accelerating. So look to the future, and what does that mean? I have found, and I suspect that every single person in this room has been involved to some degree in public education yourselves. I have found that if you can personalize the transgenerational responsibility in terms of people's families. You know, when giving a talk, you say, will everybody in the room who has a child, grandchild, or great-grandchild under 10 years old raise your hand? How about everybody doing that? Okay? Child, grandchild, or great-grandchild. All right. Put a name and a face to somebody who is going to be a young person in 2050. And what kind of world do you want it to have? And how much risk do you want to put on that world? That, I think, works better than the specific components of the scientific argument.
Bill.
I take Strobe's thing and I put it in my own kids' terms, who are 6 and 8, so in 2050 they'll be 46 and 48. And I say, that's how old I am. I'm 45. I want them to look back and say, when my dad was my age, he did something about this and either stopped it from happening, or the fact that it happened wasn't his fault. And sort of personalize it in terms of our own sense. And the other thing, Strobe has this great analogy that's in the first chapter of the book, that we're essentially running a fever. And if you run a fever, I hope everybody's temperature in this room is somewhere around 98.6. If you were at 99.6, you'd know that something funky was happening. If you were at 100.6, you'd feel pretty awful. And if you were at 102.6, which is 4 degrees, which is a little bit more than 2 degrees centigrade, you'd feel lousy and be pretty close to something tragic. And we're not playing with our body temperature, we're playing with our kids' body temperature. So if 9 out of 10 doctors told you that your kid's body temperature was moving in the direction of 103.6, and 8 out of 10 doctors told you that humans had something to do with it and were the principal cause of that happening, you would certainly question and look at the other 2 out of 10 doctors and ask, okay, well, tell me why you think that's not the case. But you'd certainly do something that the other 8 doctors are telling you to do.
One of my favorite parts of your book is about 3/4 of the way through, where you talk about the higher selfishness. And you talk about the great intellectuals who have despaired, Kant, Hegel, Freud, despaired over the lag between progress in technology and progress in morality. And you go back to Socrates and the expansion of community from the tribe to the city-state to the nation of the world. I mean, I was very intrigued with this higher sense of purpose. And you're talking about it to some degree, but what are some other ways we can come at that to get people to really think a little more philosophically about it and what kind of world we want to live in, not just in the future, as you say, Bill, but now, how we want to relate to one another?
Well, I would jump in on that because Bill's telling me to. I always do what my co-author says. I think that, in a way, the previous interchange between us answered the question. The concept of what some call intergenerational responsibility, we prefer to call it transgenerational because it's forward-leaning. It puts the emphasis on the responsibility we have to our progeny. That has been around for a long time. As Chris says, it's in the most. I'm reading this wonderful book called Christianity, the First 3,000 Years. Interesting subtitle note. And the concept of love thy neighbor as thyself, goes way, way back to pre-Judaic religions and Greek philosophy and so forth and so on, right up through Adam Smith, right? The greatest economist, the founder of modern economic theory, who basically believed that economics was driven by a kind of higher selfishness, right down to the present. What makes us different? And why does this issue loom larger for us than for anybody else? Bill found this great quote from Hannah Arendt, who we quote several times in the book. Hannah Arendt said that hers was the first generation that could both destroy the earth and leave the earth. Okay? We are the first generation that know we are already destroying the earth. And maybe the last generation, if you give that a kind of an elastic definition, who can do something about it. Though Curie and Annika, his daughters, who were two of the four dedicatees of the book, the other two being Teddy, my 11-month-old grandson, and Lola, my 3-year-old granddaughter, if we pass it to them to fix this problem and bend the curve, that's a favorite term in Washington, or bend the two curves, the curve of emissions and the curve of global warming. If we leave it to them to do it, they're not going to be able to. There's powerful science saying that we've got about 10 years. So that is a unique responsibility. And to pound that somehow into politically valent public knowledge is the big challenge, it seems to me.
And we sort of push along with a whole range of ethical thinkers, first secular and then religious, who think and talk in these terms. In politics, you know, we now live in a news cycle political culture where forward-looking thinking is measured in hours, thanks to the internet, thanks to cable television, thanks to those things. But there was a time when conservative thinkers and liberal thinkers thought in these transgenerational terms. So we talk about Edmund Burke, who saw society as who saw essentially ethics as an unspoken contract between the dead, the living, and the yet to be born. And somebody who was sort of, in many ways, exactly opposite of him at the time, Thomas Jefferson, who felt that no generation should leave a debt unpaid to a future generation. So they were very much in the same frame of thinking transgenerationally, and they were debating the terms of which different political issues would come up. And then we turn to a bunch of religious thinkers that speak in very similar terms across political traditions. And it's woven into a deeper way of thinking about ethics that I think has broad public appeal in the United States, including, you know, evangelical Christians. There is a strong evangelical environmental movement out there that sees these issues, sees both the transnational dimension of it and the transgenerational dimension of it.
This morning when we had breakfast, one thing we felt strongly about was that we wanted for us not just sit up here, as much as we enjoy chatting with each other. We really wanted audience participation. So what I'd like to do is turn this into a larger conversation with all of you and hear what you're thinking, questions. That's why we're here. Yes. If you could wait just for a minute for the purposes, not just of the audience, but for recording, for microphone.
Okay.
Please.
My name is Christy Ash, and I'm a freelance writer. And I just had a comment about these letters that you've been getting. I've written about a lot of controversial topics as a journalist, and you always get a few things. When I wrote about Agent Orange, I got called Hanoi Jane. Writing about endangered species, I got letters. But the most letters I've ever gotten in my life was this story that I wrote earlier this year about vitamins. It was for Reader's Digest, and my editors, in their infinite wisdom, put it on the cover with the headline, Vitamin Scam. And this was months ago. I'm still getting letters. I mean, I've gotten called everything in the book. And the reason, it took me some thinking about this. And I came to realize that the reason people were so mad is I was telling them they were wrong. My story was just about the fact that a multivitamin doesn't seem to make you any healthier than you would be without taking it. And that really that got people much more riled up than anything I've ever written about climate. But I think there's a lesson here, and that is you really have to think about your audience and think about their belief systems. I used to think that if I just wrote the facts, people would read it and then they would kind of make their own informed decision. That's not how people process information. It just isn't. They have these belief systems and belief frameworks, and any new evidence that you present to them, they will process through that framework. And so if you really want to get through to them, you have to be thinking about these belief systems, and you really have to present evidence that will be considered evidence within that framework. And I think in terms of climate, one thing that it's so often presented like, well, we don't have to change anything. You know, you'll still be driving. It will just be different cars, or you can change your light bulb. But if we're really honest about it and you look at the numbers, actually our way of life is really going to have to change considerably. And that's what people are lashing out at. That's what they're upset about. And I think maybe we should be more honest about this and say, hey, actually, we are going to have to change. And instead of talking about it in terms of carbon, maybe we look at it in terms of lifestyle. And for those people, those changes, start looking at it as, okay, so your lifestyle is going to change. You're going to have to use less energy. It may end up that lower energy lifestyle is a happier one for you. Maybe it means that you not only use less oil, less energy, but maybe that means you work less and you have more time with your family. All of a sudden you're not commuting. That's time in your life that you can do with it what you will. Instead of thinking about it just in terms of teaching people science, I'm not sure that that's going to be a way forward.
Bravo. Oh, except maybe on the last point, maybe I misunderstood it. You don't think teaching people science is also part of the solution?
No, it's part of the solution, but that's just the start, and there's a subset of people that's just not.
Okay.
That's not going to be the big, like, okay, I'll just give you an example. Last year, I'm sure about this example, never mind. I just think that it's not the science that's going to convince people to change their behavior, to change their ways, to change their beliefs, especially. It has to be what's in it for them, because as human beings, that's how we're programmed.
While you were making your extraordinarily, and I'm glad it's being recorded, because we're going to have to edit out some of the stuff that Chris said at the so there'll be more room. While you were speaking, Bill was not being rude when he whispered to me. He whispered one word to me: Aristotle. You may or may not know this, but you were laying out very succinctly Aristotle's case for effective rhetoric, which includes, among other things, engaging the empathy, pathos as he calls it, the empathy of the person you're talking to. That is, the reason that, and by the way, I'd like you to please send me a copy of your blog, because you'll probably save me a lot of money on multivitamins that I'm pumping into my aging body every day. I hope fish oil is still okay, but never mind. And Saul Palmetto, of course, being a guy. But in any event, what you were getting there is you were threatening them in some way. And part of the Aristotelian logic of argument is that you have to find a way of engaging their sense that you're looking out for their best. This is an issue of political leadership. And it's part of the more general Obama problem, of which there has been some mention already in the course of the conference.
I did tee up Strobe for Aristotle. I want to first do a disclaimer. There are three Greeks prominently mentioned in the book, and none of them were my idea, even though I'm Greek. Aristotle and Socrates, which have already been mentioned, yes. And the Greek patriarch.
It was totally your idea.
Bartholomew.
Totally your idea.
Not to put him in the book.
Bill's Greek.
I am. I admit to that, even in these very dark times in Greece. The thing that I was going to say about this is that in thinking about the public that has to be educated on climate change, one thing that we have learned in the last few years from the political polarization on this issue and many others is there are a number of different publics that are out there. There's a motivated public that I think writes those letters, writes more of them, is driven to do so by a media environment that essentially calls on them to engage and encourages them to engage. there is, to quote a conservative president, Ronald Reagan, there is a silent majority out there that I think we have seen an erosion in their belief in the science, and I think that's unfortunate. And so I would challenge you on the point of educating on the science. I think science education is important, and talking about climate change is important. One criticism that we make of the administration, including in an op-ed that we did in the Politico, is that the administration never really made a case for climate change. They talk about clean energy, very important, obviously. They talk about the legitimate fear that the public has about the current economic situation, totally appropriate. You're not going to convince people to sustain this issue for a generation unless you describe for them climate change, what we know, and also what we don't know. And then you get into the uncertainty issue. So I think there is a broad public that will resonate with the science. And what it involves is getting a number of validators across the political spectrum to do that. If you look at the back of the book, when you all go purchase your copy, you'll see that we were very focused on getting Republicans to endorse the book. So Dick Lugar endorses it. Bill Riley, the first Bush president's EPA administrator, endorses it. Dan Yergin, I don't know what Dan's personal politics are, but he's written about the oil industry as a sympathetic voice, and it also endorses the book. Dianne Feinstein, she's not considered at the left end of the Democratic Party. So we were very focused on speaking to the audiences that need to be persuaded as opposed to those that probably won't be persuaded.
I'm not saying that science isn't important, and I'm great. I mean, I started, in my career path as a scientist before I became a journalist. Science is really important. It's just that the science is never going to be what convinces people. Just to go back to the example I did cite earlier, last year I did a little project where I gave up travel for a year, and I gave up air travel, and I just stayed within a small radius of my house. And I did that just to kind of see what it would be like to do that and to quote unquote do my part. And in talking to other people and talking to other friends about this, they said, well, it's not important, you're not going to make a change, whatever. And it's true that this little contribution to climate change that I took back didn't change the world. But what I found out is that it really changed my life in a really positive way. And I had kind of embarked on this project to show that the limits of personal action. And instead what I found was that actually personal action was really empowering, and that the reason, so the project's done now, but I'm still traveling very little. I haven't been on an airplane. I don't plan to anytime soon. And the reason for that, it has nothing at all to do with carbon. It's that I realize that I'm way less stressed out. I realize that traveling in an airplane is one of the most unpleasant experiences a human being can have. And I mean, my father's a pilot. I will never in my life be able to make up for all the carbon I've spewed in planes my life growing up. But my point is that my environmentalist friends that I discussed this project with, they all understood that by doing air travel, they were contributing to this climate problem. They can all agree that it's a bad thing to do, and yet they're still doing it.
Good point. Yes, please.
The most efficacious places to focus our attention. It was really perversely fun to hear those letters, but let me suggest that if what we want to do is to figure out how to solve the problem, that's not the audience that we need to change. Let me suggest that the audience we need to change are those of us who are in organizations that consume a lot of energy, that have the capacity to deal with the broad range of barriers that get in the way of our changing our activities. And what that doesn't necessarily need to be, with respect to the previous question, doesn't necessarily need to be is a significant focus on our individual lifestyles. We can, not to say that there isn't real merit in changing those lifestyles, but rather there's a wide range of things that we can do using existing technologies without significantly altering our lifestyles that bring us a long way to solving the problem. Let me suggest that if we're looking for ways of developing, as you all have attempted to do in the beginning, some powerful arguments to cause change, that's the focus. The focus is on the organizations that are now burning fossil fuels, or indirectly or directly, which is all of the organizations that each of us work for, identifying the particular barriers that prevent even those of us who already believe in climate change and making that change, and using those as the focus for our rhetoric and our arguments to make the change.
Very strong and compelling and correct point. I assume you include in that political action.
Of course.
Okay.
In one's organization as well as in one's
Yeah.
broader organization, the nation
You know,
state.
I know it's both simplistic and risky to bring it all down to getting a carbon pricing bill passed through the United States Congress, but it is very damned important. And it isn't going to happen until a whole bunch of swing members of the two houses of Congress are convinced that they're not going to lose their jobs as a result of voting for it.
Right. What's striking to me about what happened in the last year, well, first of all, I think it's important to take a step back and see how far we've come, right? So as somebody that was at Kyoto, I said in one of the panels yesterday, you know, I remember in the run-up to Kyoto, a number of environmental groups coming in to meet with Vice President Gore and saying, you should introduce cap-and-trade legislation now. And Vice President Gore said, that's a great idea. How many votes have you got for that? I said, we've got Wellstone. And there was this sort of silence. You know, we have 50 votes now for this right now in the Senate. Now, it's not 60, and we all know the challenges of the filibuster, but we've come a huge way in 12 years and in 13 years. And it's important to acknowledge that. And that's not just in the political system, it's also in businesses. And what was so striking to me in the last 6 months was how many big companies not only would have allowed, but would have preferred a big piece of legislation to move forward. And the opposition that is funded on the extreme, there's been a lot of evidence, there's been a lot of rhetoric about ExxonMobil and big oil companies. Frankly, I don't think actually that's what was behind it. I think it was a lot of small businesses that don't understand the economic implications, relatively wealthy individuals from not the Fortune 100 companies or Fortune 500 companies, but people who found wealth, have ideological views, and funded opposition to this in a way that so far has been successful. I take a long-term view. I think that ultimately, you know, we're going to make major comprehensive progress on it. What the big companies that support it didn't do was get as vocal as they could have until close to the end. And what I think we're going to need to see is a lot of the bigger organizations that understand, that have looked at the science. They've sent their scientific teams and they're like, yeah, there's no doubt this is a real thing. And by the way, if we act in the right way, it's not going to be that expensive to do. Where they now tepidly support it, they need to be vocal supporters of it because of the loss of American leadership in the world as a result of this, and because they'll understand that at least in the initial stages, they'll actually save money by getting a market signal that they should make changes that they already should be making.
And why do you think they've been tepid, Bill? Public outlash?
I think part of it was they were sitting on their hands thinking that a combination of the administration, congressional leaders, and environmentalists were going to do their job for them. They didn't see it as their job. They were happy to go along, be there for the final push. They were all there ready when Lieberman, Kerry, and Graham were going to make their announcement, and when Graham backed out, they were sort of caught a little bit by surprise. You know, it's just 2 years since it's less than 2 years since the administration's been in power, and they were feeling their way on this issue.
Sure. Yes.
Mike
We'll
is
have
Mike
a
is
mic
coming.
for you in just a second.
Thanks. My name's Elizabeth Grossman, and I'm also a journalist and have written about this issue. And what I was going to ask you is if in the book or any of your other work around it, you've considered the really big difference in attitudes and practices between U.S. and Europe. And I say this because in the run-up to Copenhagen last year, I got to go on a little journalist tour of various energy-efficient projects and things on the ground in Germany and Denmark, and virtually everybody we talked to was in business, in industry. We barely spoke to anybody from an NGO, an environmental group, and the real point was to show that life was going on and people were making money. These were, you know, people who were supporting free enterprise and capitalism. They were the chambers of commerce, and I was just wondering if you'd had a chance to consider what accounts for this great gap in what seems to be everyday acceptance and practice and attitudes towards this issue?
Big yes. Big four. We have a chapter in the book called The Big Four. Our modest proposal with regard to how to get an international deal is to let the UN do the best it can, but recognize that the UN is too cumbersome to make progress in anything like the time frame that we're talking about, and therefore encourage, in parallel to what we call the G192, which is to say the whole world in the UN, 4 major powers that would develop their own unilateral, forward-looking, enlightened climate policies, and then would coordinate among themselves, and perhaps sooner rather than later even do some emissions trading among themselves. And the 4 powers are the United States, India, China, and a country that, of course, doesn't exist called Europe, the European Union. We treat the European Union, 27 countries, as a virtual country in that it has gone way ahead of a lot of actual literal countries, notably including our own, in setting targets, developing a cap-and-trade regimen, and also making money off of green technology and green exports. The Germans, for example, are eating our lunch on solar in particular. And I think Spain is doing very well in this regard. Wind, I mean, China's really eating our lunch on a lot of this stuff too. But we regard Europe as an absolute exemplar. Now, one of the ironies, of course, of last year is that the Europeans took a very forward-leaning, righteous position and tried to drive the process in Copenhagen, didn't have any luck, and ended up being, there was no European in the only meeting that really mattered in Copenhagen, which is the one that Obama busted in on with Lula and Zuma and Wen Jiabao and Manmohan Singh. No Europeans present. They got told afterwards what the accord was going to be. One reason for that is because it's to the Europeans' credit. That part of the planet, which is more blood-soaked than any other in human history, has become a zone of peace over the last 60 years. And it's done that through the creation of the European Union and because individual countries have been willing to pool sovereignty. Well, you can get, I think it's a capital offense, if I'm not mistaken, to talk about pooling sovereignty in some countries that I can think of. Europe came right up against the sovereignty hawks of this world. India, China, and the United States. That's a big part of the dynamic of what happened at Copenhagen.
But just to follow up, I was actually thinking more on the ground at the sort of everyday, average, middle-class level. There just seems to be a real absence of the kind of skepticism and fear and resistance to an energy-efficient house, a low-carbon lifestyle. People have taken this on board. I was asking about some things here that we have signs up as to sort of herald their great innovation, and nobody could even remember when the low-flush toilet or the light switch that turned off everything came in, because they've had them for so long. And I was wondering if, in addition to looking at the high-level diplomatic influences on these changes, if you looked at sort of the on-the-ground, the letter writers.
Well, for the last 12 years since Kyoto, there has been a terrific state-to-state learning between the best practices in the best European countries and the best states in the United States on this. So as the Northeast tried to put together emissions trading, as California did, and that does trickle down at some level, because what do you know, you have higher energy prices, or you've switched to better forms of energy, away from coal to natural gas in those places. So some of that learning has happened. We don't get into deep detail in the book, but we do talk about, in the United States, there are the Priuses and the Portlands of the world, right? So there are learnings in the United States. I just spent some time in Greece on vacation, and on the one hand, they have $8 a gallon gasoline. And there's enormous diversity within Europe on how well they're doing on their targets. Greece, Portugal, Italy, Spain are pretty far behind, and Eastern Europe is way behind where Germany and Denmark and others are. So there's enormous diversity. That said, they have $8 a gallon gasoline in Greece, and that drives certain things on the one hand. On the other hand, you don't see a whole lot of Priuses there. Part of the reason for that is that Europeans are much more protectionist on cars. So you see little tiny Fiats that get worse gas mileage than my Prius at home. Because a Prius in Europe costs $30,000, where it cost me $23,000. So, there are some things in Europe that are somewhat self-serving for Europeans. And we do call Europe out on that a little bit. And the reason that we do it is Europe now faces a big challenge moving forward. I think the Euro crisis showed that pooled sovereignty potentially has its limits. Germany not necessarily wanting to do what the rest of Europe wanted them to do on bailing out Greece. And the challenge for Europe is as those emission restrictions really start to bind and come down in a way that they didn't in the last 12 years. Europe's targets at Kyoto were not nearly as ambitious as they appeared for a number of different reasons. They're quite ambitious moving forward. If they're going to really make their targets, countries are going to feel the pinch. And some of the countries that don't have that progressive mindset, I heard a lot of, they're paying their $8 a gallon. There's not a whole lot of people in Greece that believe in climate change because it's always hot there. And they don't think that it's that much hotter than it used to be. So there's a lot of public education that still has to happen in the southern and eastern parts of Europe.
Yes.
Thank you. My name is Bright Simmons, and I work on another global challenge, that of counterfeit medicines. And coming from Africa, I think it's much more starker to me that one of the, or probably I should say the central issue, militating against climate change, behavioral changes, is probably that of competing priorities. And when you look at some of the other global challenges that we face, whether it's social justice, economic inequality, etc., there has never been a time when the moral agency seemed so stuck. And I think that is the problem. We've never had a situation in history where a major problem acknowledged by many of our leading thinkers had been addressed as one requiring moral agency, which is the way we have been pushing climate change. That is, we must act now, we must act immediately, and we must act uniformly. And we don't have that kind of precedent. So we have to develop it totally out of scratch. And I think that kind of situation is complicated because, in particular, in an instance where there's so many impersonal forces, so major industries, whether it's the energy industry or some other kind of industry that has significant impact on this problem, has to change. And all these impersonal forces then mean that the individual who is asked to partake in this particular moral agency feels alienated in some instances. So my fear was that the more we get elite consensus, the more the street is likely to rebel, because they can't see their direct connection to the moral agency, which a lot of us are urging.
I think it's a very powerful point. And Bill and I scratched our bald heads trying to come up with some kind of useful precedent to the challenge and the required response that we're talking about in the context of this conference. And the closest we could come was not all that close. The closest we could come was the only time in human history before this when humankind has known that it faced an existential threat. And that was rather recently, within the lifetimes of virtually all of us in this room. And it was the Cold War. It was the threat of global thermonuclear war, which does have some analogs to climate change, certainly including international cooperation, coordination rather than competition, not to mention war and so forth and so on. But there are very significant differences, and you put your finger on one. Avoiding global thermonuclear war did not require moral agency of the kind that you're talking about. It required moral agency, or morality, if you can put it that way, which was also common sense, on the part of a very small number of leaders, like two, like the President of the United States and the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. But as long as those two guys got up every day and said, I don't care what happens today, I'm not going to press a button starting World War III, we didn't have World War III. In other words, it was a negative action not doing something really stupid. Now, we spent trillions of dollars on, ICBMs and all of the hardware of deterrence, which was wasted, whereas a lot of money that we could spend addressing climate change would not be wasted. It would actually be quite useful and productive. But what we have to do now is affirmative action. We have to actually do stuff rather than not do something stupid. And the we that have to do it are not just the guy in the White House and the guy in the Kremlin and other people in political power around the world. It means all of us, going back to a theme throughout all this. And that requires, as you say, kind of what we call an ethical revolution, or a revolution in global civics.
Gentleman from Texas.
As an aside, is Rick Perry and his subscriber to National Geographic?
Rick Perry?
Yeah, our governor.
I know a Rick Perry photographer, but
No, our governor.
The governor of
Oh.
Texas.
No, my comment though, my comment though is that I take issue with someone who made the comment that we need to focus on large organizations, and that our own individual decrease in our use of our use of fossil fuels and stuff, buying more stuff and having bigger houses and not doing the green type of stuff individually is in error, because there's 300 million people in the United States, and if we could get at least half of those to begin to think more green, we probably could save a great deal of the carbon footprint, and also encourage more employment in those areas, which would certainly do a lot for the economy. And I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't think capitalism is a good thing, but there's a way to improve upon it in doing a lot of things individually. Do you want to comment on that?
That's great.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I mean, I think, as opposed to disagreeing, what we put our emphasis on the book is sort of I'd say a management consultant's focus on what Richard Gephardt described as the most complex political transaction in the history of mankind, right? Because essentially we have to revolutionize, just in the United States, a sixth of our economy. That's the same size as healthcare. We saw how hard that was to do politically. And then you have to do it in every other country in the world, right? So imagine how hard that political thing in the United States is in all of those other countries, and then bring everybody in a room. There's not 192 of us. We all wouldn't agree clearly on what the best emphasis should be. How do we negotiate a common approach? And so we try to break it down pretty simply and say, look at these big four players. What does it take domestically in those four systems to get the kind of political will that will nudge people into doing the right thing? And actually, in all four of those systems, it's a different deal. Europe already, right now we emit over 6 or about 6 gigatons, 6 billion tons of carbon in the U.S., 300 million people. Europe is at about 4 with 400 million people. So their per capita emissions are much lower for a number of different reasons, some having nothing to do with climate change. The French went nuclear, having nothing to do with climate change. Their per capita emissions are quite low. Germany shut down half their economy, their per capita, because of Eastern Germany's collapse. Their emissions are quite low, but they're high in other places. So it's a different deal politically in Europe. And in India and China, frankly, they don't even know how to measure their emissions, which is one of their great concerns about a binding agreement. So we try to focus on what does it take for these four countries to line up and send a signal to the rest of the world that they're doing something. That doesn't undermine the need for individuals to act responsibly, for corporations to act responsibly, for some people to change their lifestyles. I guess if I would disagree with you, is I think the time is too short to have a revolution in lifestyle change in order to address the issue.
I think it's necessary but not sufficient
It's necessary but not sufficient to.
for individuals to act.
I think it's helpful but not necessary. Because if you say that it's necessary and you're not going to get it, then you're going to be missing something that was necessary. And I don't think we're going to have a revolution in the next 10 years.
But if you look at the numbers,
We do, but we have to start emitting less now, and that slope will, essentially we're already flat on our emissions in the U.S. for a number of different reasons, including the economic crisis. We have to come down really dramatically. What are the signals that we are sending about where we're going to be 40 years ago that in the next 5 to 10 years start moving that trend downward? And it's a combination of different things, including urging different lifestyles. But my sense is in the next 10 years, we're not going to accomplish a lifestyle revolution. We have to have a price signal revolution.
We can get Governor Perry a subscription. It's not a problem. Betty, John, we'll work on that. I don't know if it'll make any difference, but we'd like to try. Go ahead, please.
It's good that you have a lot of patience.
I have no comment. Go ahead, please.
Just a quick comment, but I really wanted to ask two questions. The comment is, Obama ran on hope and change, and the country was ready for that, but change is very scary. And I think that a lot of the resistance we're seeing is people are scared of uncertainty. And when you ask them to change, like you guys said, we're talking about proactive actions. And that's always difficult for people to engage in. So I think that's a big barrier for us. But the two questions are, one, why do you feel that Obama didn't, and I know there are a lot of complex political machinations that go on, why didn't he, when he had his Oval Office speech, take more of a leadership role in kind of taking advantage of the Gulf crisis? I mean, I feel like that was sort of a crisis that was handed to him in a sense. And there's a lot of anger out there. And if you look at the anger that people feel about the health insurance industry, and then you look at the fossil fuel industry, one is vastly more wealthy than the other. I think the wealthiest health insurance company makes, has a 12th of the capital of the largest, energy company. But so where was the anger there? Because I feel like there's a lot of anger in the public, and that wasn't really responded to in Washington. And the second one is about the CLEAR Act and why you feel, just what your perspective is on why that never gained any traction. Because in my mind, sending people a check is something that was much more, optically beneficial for Congress to be pushing than, cap and trade or a tax or whatever.
Well, on the latter one, on the former one, the question about why he didn't do the Oval Office, at Brookings we try to analyze how you have impact and how you move the debate. And the thing that I think the personal mistake was to have put healthcare in front of energy, partly because I think there was a broader bipartisan consensus at the time to move on energy. The Democrats got 8 Republican votes in the House of Representatives last summer for comprehensive energy legislation, which is a high watermark of bipartisanship in the last 2 years. And I think the reason for that, the reasons that he didn't do it in the Senate first are complicated. I think they had to do with, on the left, union politics. Labor unions don't like it as much, and in the Senate we're more powerful in a few core states that matter. And also that Max Baucus, frankly, prioritized health care over energy, and he had to do what the Finance Committee chairman. It's really small, narrow things, but he wouldn't have gotten anywhere in the Senate, or he would have had to have done a completely different deal. So by the time it comes around to the oil spill, it becomes very complicated. I think the politics of the oil spill had become so dangerous for the White House by the time they got to the Oval Office speech that they thought that a lot of people would say, this is a bait and switch. We just want you to fix the damn well. And you're distracting us and changing the subject. And they didn't feel that they could pull it off. And they didn't see that it was going to get them the 7 votes or whatever they needed to get, or 8 votes that they needed to get from roughly 52 to 60 for cloture. I think at that point they knew that they weren't going to get it. And he only mentions the word climate once in the speech when he talks about the Waxman-Markey bill, that they had passed comprehensive energy and climate legislation. I think they included it in there so that there wouldn't be a backlash from environmentalists, that they avoided it as opposed. And what was striking to me, watching it from afar when I was on vacation, was how much in the blogosphere and in the press, people focused on that one mention as having shifted the attention, as opposed to not having paid enough attention to the issue. My own sense, having watched this over, first of all, I'm a proponent of cap and trade as opposed to tax and rebate, because the problem with a tax is you're controlling for price, you're not controlling for carbon. I think it's really important to send the signal of where you want carbon to be, as opposed to fixing it with a tax. And I think there's also a political reason behind it, which is, if you remember, in the spring of '93, when Bill Clinton passed his own deficit reduction and a 4-cent gas tax, which, there was no public rebate involved. But in their mind, they were doing it for climate change. That was never communicated to the public. If you're going to do it, you have to send a message that this is about climate change. Yes, it has clean energy. Yes, it has economic benefits. But I think you have to sell it for what it is. And I don't think anybody's ever had faith that clear would be a persuasive way to do things, because it's not fighting pollution. The idea of a cap, the trade part has now gotten completely messed up in a different, odd political discussion where it was meant to bring conservatives and market forces in, and somehow or another it seems like Ponzi trading or a bad trading scheme. I don't think a tax and rebate would have been convincing to people that we were really addressing the challenge, and I think they felt that way too.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Olivia, and I guess I'm just feeling really a bit naive. I don't understand why this is such a partisan issue in our Senate. I don't understand why we have to grovel to get 8. I mean, 8 seems like such a small number, and I don't understand why that divide is there.
You go.
Well, we could actually do a duet.
Okay. You say one word, I'll say the other, and we'll see where it ends.
Whenever anybody introduces a question by saying it's naive, I always worry. I said, we're going to get a very basic, good question that we should have faced up to before now. It's not a naive question, because if ever there was an issue on which there both morally should be bipartisanship, and for practical, hard-headed partisan reasons, there should be bipartisanship, it's this one. And nobody makes that argument more strenuously and effectively than Lindsey Graham. We quote, and I think it's the last chapter, Lindsey Graham, we begin the last chapter with an interview that Lindsey Graham gave to Tom Graham, basically saying, Republicans, if they want their party to survive another generation, should get with the program here, because young people aren't going to want to belong to a Republican party which is obscurantist and obstructionist on climate change. Okay, so why has it happened? It's happened, and this is, I think, an analytically defensible and nonpartisan point, because of extreme partisanship on the part of the Republican leadership in both houses right now. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't some prominent exceptions to it, but even those prominent exceptions, I'm reminded of something Bill Clinton, a president I used to work for, once said. The difference between Republicans and Democrats is that Democrats fall in love and Republicans fall in line. Well, the Republicans have fallen in line on what is basically a just say no strategy in dealing with Barack Hussein Obama and the Democratic Party heading into midterm elections, which everybody expects the Republicans to do very well in. And that means making sure that he doesn't succeed on anything. And this would be a big win. I think it really is that simple.
Yeah, I agree. And the only thing that I'd add is that Democrats have made it easy for them to do it, because there are a core number of Democratic senators who have not supported this. And they come from places that really worry about their economic future, like West Virginia and North Dakota, that are very heavily dependent on coal. I mean, one of the things that I've followed, one of the great websites that I followed over the last 2 years in tracking this, is Nate Silver at 538.com, which, if you've not gone to this website, it's just terrific. And what he does is he lists the members of Congress, Democrat and Republican, that are for, against, or in the middle on climate change. And he lays it out against the carbon footprint per capita of those states. So North Dakota and West Virginia emit 20 tons of carbon per person per year. Whereas in the Northeast, it's easy to be green, right? You know, the Kermit Frog thing, it's hard to be green. It's easy to be green if your state, like New Jersey, because you're on most of your electricity is on natural gas, or there are trains that can take you into New York City if you commute, you emit 6 tons per year. It's really hard to be green if you're Jay Rockefeller. And for me, one of the most moving but also sad things about the last few months was the death of Robert Byrd, right? Byrd was the co-author of the Byrd-Hagel resolution, which essentially handcuffed us at Kyoto, and has been an opponent of climate change forever. In the last 2 years, he came out essentially saying, I suddenly understand the long-term consequences of this, and I'm looking at my grandkids, and I'm ashamed at what I've done, as well as a number of other things in his life that he'd done. And I don't think we should be on the wrong side of this issue. And then he passed away, and the person that was appointed to replace him said, I'll tell you one thing I'm not going to vote for is cap and trade. And that essentially was one of the final nails in the coffin. I don't begrudge a senator to look out for their people in a state like that, but we do have to acknowledge that there were a number of Democratic senators that made it easy for Republicans to say, I'm not going to be the one that sticks my neck out and be the 60th vote that puts this over the top.
Gentlemen, back there.
This guy's been very patient over here. Next. Okay.
I'm Surya Dungyal. You know, one of the things that in both of you mentioned that since G192, you know, will not work, you know, because it will take a long time. You know, you subdivided, you know, into 4 major actors: U.S., European, you know, whole Union as an entity, India, and China. When you see India and China as a, you know, just probably the carbon emitting major countries, you know, since they're in the developing part of the world, especially when you said the South Asia, there is hardly any dialogue among the nation about the nature of problems and the gravity of situation, the kind of complexity it has. The people are quite unaware about the, you know, the seriousness of the problem. And these countries, without having enough dialogue among the nation, you know, if they take a lead role, how do you see that, you know, what mechanism do you suggest in order to have a horizontal, you know, communication or dialogue among the 4, then the vertical dialogue with other nations?
I don't disagree with the point at all. I think it's actually a terrific point. You know, I often get yelled at by friends in Canada for not including them, right? And not to mention Mexico, who's hosting this upcoming Cancun meeting.
Wait till you next go to Tokyo.
Yeah, right, and right. Not to mention the Japanese, Russians, Brazilians, and Indonesians, which are a big part of the game. You know, the ambassador from Sudan was just here. South Africa has played a very leading role in the negotiations, and why didn't we include them, or Nigeria, which is the biggest country in Africa, not to mention a major oil producer. I think what happens is if those 4 countries lead, their neighbors start climbing on their backs and saying, so what about us? So with the U.S., and you know, we look north and south, and we have major oil producers to the north and south. You know, the Canadian oil sands have been a huge, or tar sands have been a huge source of American imports. All of us have our own regional politics, and I think when the big actors move forward, those regional politics will catch up to them.
We have time for one more question. There's been a gentleman between Betty and Sarah who's been very patient.
I haven't heard anything in the last 2 days about what the state and local governments are doing. And it's been my experience, I live in Florida near Sarasota, that the state and local governments are doing one hell of a lot of work on climate change through making their buildings more efficient, through putting traffic lights through LED, and encouraging their citizens to get in touch with reality, and that's the climate change. Sarasota is ground zero in terms of sea level rise. I'm on the board of the local opera. We're 5 or 6 blocks away from Sarasota Bay, and I can guarantee you in 50 years we're going to be beachfront. So it's a major issue there. Look at what California has done. Certainly the issues there that on the ballot are trying to reverse it, but nonetheless they've taken the lead. And we've talked so much about local, okay, and global and things like that, but we haven't had any talk or discussion today or yesterday about what is really going on in the grassroots. And one hell of a lot of work is being done there. So let's forget about Congress until the congressman gets some sense about them and focus on what's happening on the local levels. And that's one point. Make one more other point. I'm doing a lot of lecturing on climate change, and I'm going to tell you, Middle America has no clue about what's really going on in climate change. They come up to me and say, Feder, tell me, is that really climate? Do we really have a problem? And I look at them, and from what planet have you come from? Don't you read the newspapers? Well, I look at my computer, and that's part of the problem. People aren't reading today. They're not getting the message. You have to figure out another way of getting that message across, and it's through the computer. And unfortunately, publishing is a dead and dying thing. Sorry.
Well,
now we're going too far.
I'll take issue with that.
That's hyperbole.
We have
but it's an issue.
more than 40 million people who read National Geographic magazine.
Yep.
And we don't want that to be any less. I think one thing I would like both of you to respond to is your point's very well taken, and there certainly should be encouragement from local initiatives and local leadership. There's no question about that. But I think what really is important is how much time have we got? This is what really worries me. I mean, I feel this clock ticking. As we're producing stories, Dennis Dimmick, our environment editors, we're looking at stories 2 years down the road that we're planning for National Geographic magazine, and the clock's ticking. So to say we've got to wait for the men and women in Congress to act, and local will push it, that worries me. What are your thoughts?
2 points, and I want to take the second point first. At the risk of, I'm going to have to move my chair a little bit away from you. Even though journalism is the only profession I ever chose, and I spent 21 years working for a terrific journalistic enterprise, which was Time Incorporated, I think that the condition, the prospects, the behavior, and the performance of the American media have been abysmal on this and virtually every other issue of importance to this nation, with the prominent exception, certainly, of National Geographic, especially on environmental issues. But the Fourth Estate is in dreadful condition, and I'm going to see Walter in a few minutes, and I think some of us should come back next summer and have a conference on the future of the media. And I think it's definitely part of the problem, particularly with regard to public education. Now, here's a yes-but answer to your question about cities and states. And we do devote quite a bit of attention to this in the book.
Because our Metro program told us we had
to. Yeah, and it's a very compelling and admirable story. I mean, you mentioned California. I think it's significant that under Republican governors, which is to say Mitt Romney and Schwarzenegger, Massachusetts and California had climate change policies considerably more enlightened and proactive than the United States government. And of course, there's Sarasota, there's Portland. There are lots of examples. However, that we cannot say forget about Congress and let's do it at the local and state level, because among other things, that would be a regulatory nightmare. Imagine being the chairman of a national, not to mention a global company, and you had to bring, and you had factories in all 50 states, and you had to adjust your practices in each one of those states depending on what the regulations in the states were. You have to have a degree of uniformity. So that's why there has to be, otherwise you end up with a patchwork that is actually worse than nothing, because it sets up tensions, and you have companies moving back and forth to see, arbitraging who's got the better or the worse regulations and so forth and so on. We have to have national legislation on this.
all of the above.
Ditto, Rush?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess if I'd end on a note of optimism, since I played the optimist on a panel yesterday, and I sort of like, I've had my 2 double espressos today, which allows me to be optimistic at the Volt stand.
Free.
The first note of optimism is the sticks that the administration has and that they'll continue to use, because frankly, a lot of engaged citizens who care about the issue are going to push them. So the Environmental Protection Agency has the authority to regulate for carbon dioxide. And I think the administration won't give up, because they are an executive branch, and executive branches don't like to give away their power. they're going to use their power. They have to be careful because they don't want to do it in a partisan way that drives potential Republican supporters for the bill. And there are a number of Republicans that want to do something on this, but need political cover. So that's optimistic thing number one. Optimistic thing number two is, in addition to looking how far we've come, I like to talk about my 8-year-old daughter that gets in our Prius and yells at me for turning on the air conditioning. And she still does it, and she does it all the time, and she's persistent and consistent about it. And I don't do enough on climate change as far as she's concerned. And she didn't get it from me. She got it from the public schools. And we live in a I don't live in Washington. I actually live in central Virginia. We live in a place, in a county where Appomattox County, we live in Charlottesville and Albemarle County. Albemarle County is next to Appomattox County, where there are still more Confederate flags in the graveyard than there are Union flags. Now, Charlottesville is a little bit of a people's republic, but it's not that much so. We still have doubters and deniers, but not at the 8-year-old level. And that's, I think, the thing that gives me the most hope.
Last word I'm going to say is, last week, my grandson, Teddy, who's one of the co-dedicatees, who's 11 months old, said his first word in intelligible English, and it was hot. I'd like to think it was in connection with what we're talking about today.
Strobe, thank you for just signing my book.
You
Bill,
did, now
I'll
do
pass it
too.
to you as well. There'll be a book signing in the lobby in just a few minutes. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. It was great fun, and thank all of you for attending and your questions as well.